Joe Biden unveils his climate change proposal. Could a GOP revolt actually take place when it comes to tariffs on Mexico? And the governor of Texas could be in some hot water over a voter purge there. Also, the Parkland, Florida school resource officer who hid outside the building during the shooting is now facing 11 charges, including negligence and perjury.
Team Rising is here. We got Estuardo Rodriguez. He's a Democratic strategist and principal with the Rabin Group. And Lauren Claffey is a Republican strategist. She previously worked at the Department of Homeland Security as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. Lauren and Estuardo, welcome. Thank you so much for being
good morning.
here.
Thank you.
We've got some Biden stuff going on here. Biden's getting all big on the climate. Here's what he had to say.
By the end of my first term, we will have an enforcement mechanism in place to make sure we stay on track to get there. You know, we're going to make record-breaking investments in research and development in zero-carbon technologies so that America is the engine of the world's clean energy economy.
So apparently, what did he do exactly, Crystal?
All right. So let me give a little bit of the backstory here. So some aides from Biden had talked to news outlet, I think it was the AP, about his then pending climate change plan that we hadn't seen yet, and said he was looking for a middle ground. This made progressives very angry. There was a lot of pressure on him to come up with something bigger. This plan is pretty big. It looks like it kind of models the Green New Deal. However, Lauren, some of the lines in the plan appear to have been plagiarized from other sources. If not a lot of them, but a few of them. And given Joe Biden's past history and problems with plagiarism, this has caught a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's reflective of how hastily they put this plan together. It seems as though they probably were moving towards a more moderate policy position, and then once they got the progressive backlash, they quickly had to shift gears in order to respond to the electorate. It's kind of curious. It's kind of curious because Joe Biden is the man to beat right now in in the Democratic primary, and we're going to see a lot of these attacks going forward. Where people think that he's not liberal enough, he's trying to moderate. He's got a lot of older voters, Democratic voters on that are polling with him and supporting him, and so that's giving him a lot of support early on. But he's got to contend with this more progressive wing of the party that is going to push him farther and farther left on a lot of issues. But he doesn't want to run the risk of isolating those more Democratic moderates. This is going to be even more interesting because you see some of these attacks coming now too from the abortion, on his abortion positions. And we saw a report out from NBC News this morning, criticizing his evolution on abortion positions, on women's rights, on the fact that he still supports the Hayes Amendment and not supporting federal funding for abortions. And so, there's going to be a lot more of this coming out because everybody is going to be looking to push him farther and farther left on some of these positions.
I mean, I'm not trying to give him too much of a hard time here, Estuardo, because all campaigns look at other sources, they draw from a lot. However, how long has this dude been thinking about running for president? Really? I mean, and that you're just cobbling this together at the last minute to respond to, look, I'm glad he responded to the criticism. I'm glad he went bigger on this than he was probably planning to go. However, it does feel a little bit like they should have their ducks in a row a bit better.
Sure. I also don't want to go too far in beating him up on this because we're talking about Joe Biden, who was vice president and under 8 years of the Obama administration where there were significant efforts to take a position and make the United States a leader on the environment. Whether clearly any of that still exists thanks to this administration, I think Biden's first step is going to be, let's get back to the Paris Accord, right? But I agree with you 100%. He's in a tug of war now between a much younger, fresher, energized, progressive base out there that is not the base that he probably would have been running had he run for president right after Obama's administration.
Well, and there's also new science since the Obama years. I mean, everybody recognizes basically on the left, it's not enough to go back to what the Obama administration is doing. They have to go much further, and I think that has pushed him a little bit out of his comfort zone here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that a lot of his policy positions are kind of in that mold. He is not the man of the current party or the younger party of the Democrats. And so there's going to be a lot of these instances where he is going to be, I think we're going to see more evolutions from Joe Biden as he's adjusting to the new politics of the situation.
Joe Biden evolutions. It's always that's a safe bet for sure. Senate Republicans are saying there's some problems perhaps with the tariffs. Here's Mitch McConnell, also known as Cocaine Mitch, laying it out.
Well, there is not much support in my conference for tariffs, that's for sure.
Oh, okay. That was quick. Thanks, Mitch. Mitch really set the table for us there,
There's not much else
Lauren.
to say, right?
So we know he's going to start with 5%. It's going to go all the way up to 25% month to month. If they're
Talking about Mexico here, not
yeah.
China, just so we can all keep our
Tariffs
regimes
in order.
straight here.
I don't know if this is the way to go. I'm not sure. You're getting the president now with some pushback from the Senate Republicans. What would be the metrics for Mexico to really comply with this in a way that the tariffs wouldn't go into effect? If tariffs do go into effect, what do they have to do to have the tariffs not go into effect? I mean, heaven forbid, but I'm not sure that this is the right move, Lauren.
I don't think so either. I think ultimately that we are responsible for our immigration problem, and so we need to. Trump needs to work with Congress to reform the laws, right? Like, I mean, he's failed a couple times on actually getting Congress to move on this, and that's where he needs to be putting his effort. Putting this on Mexico, that they're going to somehow stem the migration from Central America and stop any people for us into coming into the country is just not a viable solution. And so, one thing that this has done, though, is Mexico has always been flip-floppy on as far as how much they're willing to work with the U.S. on immigration policy. They've been sort of helpful under certain administrations, less so under different administrations. And so, in the very least, what this did was scare the crap out of them and force them to come immediately to Washington and start negotiating with Congress, this past week.
Yeah,
because they just don't know.
Today, I think, with Pence and Pompeo and a Mexican delegation.
Exactly. So, if that was the sole goal of this, scare them, bring them to the table, maybe it was successful. But I just don't think that we don't want to put tariffs on our allies. And Mexico, especially their economy and businesses, are too intrinsically tied to the United States. And I think that that's part of the reason why Republican senators are pushing back so hard on this, because so many of the businesses that are in their districts, in their states, rely on that free trade agreement between Mexico, and so putting tariffs that actually will impact them in a way that it's more palatable to put tariffs on China because they are an adversary.
Right.
You don't want to do it
we're
on your
also with
allies.
China. You're talking about we're unhappy with their trade policy, right? So it's like it's a tool that makes sense in the context, right? I mean, sort of, we've come a long way from build the wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. Right?
Well, but that's still his strategy, is that through the tariffs he will declare he was able to get Mexico to pay for the wall. I mean, let's be clear, this is a political re-election tactic. That's all this is. And all the Senate Republicans claiming that they're against tariffs, they don't have veto-proof numbers over there in the Senate.
They're saying they might.
They absolutely have not, mostly because I will say this because they know that House Republicans are much more eager to support Donald Trump on this, and they don't want to upset them either. So you have 10, 15 Republicans in the Senate willing to say they're upset and frustrated and concerned. That's all that's going to happen, because they're not going to get the numbers that they need to override any tariffs that this president's going to push forward.
What do you think of what Lauren's saying, that this is basically a bluff? I mean, Trump has said explicitly it is not a bluff, but that doesn't really mean anything.
Right, it doesn't mean anything at all. But I think here's the bigger danger.
Take his word to the bank at this point, Crystal.
Here's the bigger danger for me is that you have the president negotiating trade agreements with other countries, and other countries are looking at how he's handling the Mexico-Canada
this is the part of it that actually I have the greatest problem with, because I think this gets in the way of China, where I think he's really on the right track, whether it works or not. I don't think that I think the Mexico thing becomes a distraction from the China tariffs.
Well, and the additional concern is that if other countries are seeing that you can't take the United States at its word, that on the one hand you have a trade agreement ready to go, and then you're going to stick tariffs on top of that to say, yeah, I know we have a trade agreement, but we're going to start taxing you now on all the imports. So we're not even talking about just avocados. We're talking about U.S. Cars that are manufactured in Mexico.
Right.
16 states on the southern and Midwest rely on trade with Mexico. 16 states, and the majority of them are Republican and red states.
And that's why Ted Cruz in particular is so upset here.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's speaking of Texas, there was, in advance of the 2018 midterms, an effort to purge a whole bunch of Texas voters from the voter rolls. It was ultimately blocked because it was such a mess. This all started, it appeared to start at least, when the Secretary of State claimed that there were 100,000 non-voters on the roll, and that 58,000 actually voted, undocumented immigrants had actually voted in their
Rodriguez.
exactly.
All cousins.
So you just got to go through and look for Rodriguez and just kick those people out. Good for nothing. We actually talked to the Attorney General of Texas a couple months back about this purge, because he was one of the people that tweeted out, with siren alerts that 58,000 illegals had voted. This turns out not to be the case. When we pressed him on it, this is what he had to say.
That was our Department of Public Safety. So our state police came to those numbers. Whether those numbers are accurate, that's for us to now determine. We have to.
So you don't know that it's 58,000?
I don't know if the Department of Public Safety, I don't know if our DPS got that right or not. We're going to find out eventually. We'll have
How did they get to the number?
You'll have to ask them. It's a number that they either did accurately or they didn't do accurately. Our job is to find out through investigation whether those are accurate.
Will you know?
So the plot, Estuardo, has now thickened. Apparently the governor himself pushed for this purge, which is something that he had denied in the past. Now we have emails that have been exposed through transparency requests that show he was directly involved in this mess.
Right. Well, I mean, this is not just a Texas conservative issue, but this is across the country. There are efforts to purge voter rolls, and it's very much a conservative campaign tactic. And whether or not it's successful, it's in actually getting these thousands of illegal voters. It's successful in the campaign messaging when you're out there. And we look at what's happening in Florida right now. They know very well that what's going to happen in the 2020 election is going to be definitive, and they're looking at how to purge their voter rolls as well. I think the governor is going to stand by what happened in that state, even if it purged many conservative voters. They're going to say it was worth it. You can come back with your birth certificate or your driver's license and get back on. And they're going to stand by that all the way through the elections.
What do you think, Lauren? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I sort of. I think that it is good government to go through records and make sure that they're clean. I think that this was a failure of good government in the way that they executed it. Obviously, they were called on it. But I will say, I think that scandals these days are not sticking the way that they used to.
Yeah.
And, one of the points of this was that the gentleman went back on the payroll and continued to work for the governor even after he had messed this up, the Secretary of State. So, and then it's kind of like Virginia with Ralph Northam, being in the picture with the Ku Klux Klan, and he's saying that he wasn't even, dressed up that way. It wasn't him. Don't worry about it. I'm going to stay in office. So I think it's more so it's an interesting political moment of what do voters really care about and what is
get away with anything.
And do you get away with everything right now? Is the news just so quick that we just move on to the next thing without everyone stopping to say, wait, this wasn't right. We do want action here.
I kind of agree with you, except that this is Northam and his blackface and the Halloween party in that scenario. I mean, that's something that I think people were upset by. But this is something that over the last, I would say, maybe 5-6 years, we've seen as a movement that, especially from Donald Trump, that there's 3 million undocumented voters that participate in the election. And that's why the popular vote turned out the way it did, because of all the undocumented immigrants who were voting. It's become a messaging tactic that we're being attacked. And every time we talk about voter purging, it's tied to that messaging.
But there are dead people on voter roll. I mean, there is
not 3 million, not 200,000.
I didn't say 3 million. I said there are.
But the thing is, the messaging is that we are being attacked. And so, yes, I agree. 10, 20, 30, deceased people who show up out of in Chicago. That's something that may or may not happen. But the messaging is a scare tactic, and it's been successful. And Donald Trump is going to continue to use that all the way to the
it would be
elections.
unsuccessful, or wouldn't be as successful, if every time they tried to do any kind of investigation to whether there was a problem with larger scale voter fraud or something, they didn't always have Democrats say, well, we can't do that.
Well, because it always seems like it's done in bad faith. That's the thing is, the president makes a wild claim. He puts Chris Kobach in charge of the thing.
Yeah, but I mean, the data is the data, and every time there's an effort anywhere to actually look into voter fraud, the Democrats are opposed to it. Every time.
Anytime we press the president to prove where the 3 million voters came from, or Greg Abbott, or in your interview, show us where.
Well, Abbott was just like it was Department of Public Safety, man. I don't know what to tell you. And then we were like, okay,
but they knew that data was flawed. They knew that data wasn't unreliable, but they used it because it was easy to get. And then when they were asked, how do you prove it? They said, well, you're going to have to ask them. It's scapegoating. And then he gives them a job that's $200,000 a year on the taxpayers.
I just do want to point out that there was a commission under Obama to come up with ways to modernize our voting system, to deal with the problems of voter rolls and dead people on them and whatever. A number of smart solutions were offered, and Republicans were like, nah, we're good. We're good. Another interesting news item here that we wanted to get your thoughts on, though, Parkland shooting obviously killed 17, injured another 17, and the school resource officer who was on duty at that time came under a lot of heat because basically he did not confront this shooter. His name's Deputy Scott Peterson. He was suspended in the immediate aftermath, later resigned, and now he faces, Lauren, 11 charges of neglect of a child, culpable negligence, and perjury, and was just booked into the Broward County Jail with a bond of $102,000. Pretty remarkable development here for this individual to actually be held accountable for failing to act to try to do more to prevent this shooter.
Yeah, I mean, normally I am very sympathetic to the job that law enforcement officers have to do day in and day out. It is hard and you're making tough decisions every moment. But this is one of those moments where this was a fundamental aspect of your job. And, I kind of looked and I was like, wait, what was his training like? Did he actually get the training that he needed to be successful in this situation? And he went through the active shooter training. And, I think people sometimes think that active shooter training is just, you're sitting in a classroom and they kind of tell you what to do. There are actors, you are put in real situations where there is dummy bullets, there are actors, there is blood. You are put in a very realistic situation to make sure that you know how to mitigate the threat and stop it immediately. And that is the first thing that they tell you during active shooter training, is that you go in and you have to go assess the situation, you go into the building, you find out where the shooter is, and you call for backup, you go try to stop the threat. I mean, while he was sitting in another building, and while he was sitting in that building, he didn't even go to confirm that there was a shooting. He didn't confirm and see what type of gun the shooter had, nothing. And he also told other deputies to stay away, other officers to stay away. And when he did that, 6 people died in the building.
I mean, according to a Public Safety Commission report that was published in January, and this is per NPR, Peterson didn't go into the building. He hid for 48 minutes at the base of a stairwell after the first shots were fired.
I think there was a lot of misinformation in the beginning about who this individual was. There was the idea that you have a school security guard, and perhaps some people thought that's who he was, and so there was a pass given. Well, he's a school security guard. They don't really sign up for these kind of scenarios. But when you find out, as you mentioned, he had the training. He was a deputy. He had control
He's an
over
armed
the officers.
deputy
Yes, an armed
law
deputy.
enforcement community. Yeah, he's got a gun.
And had control over the actions of other officers. Then you realize, this complete dereliction of duty and the lives that came at a cost. I think the larger message here is, what are we going to do? Because we can indict him, we can convict him, he can go to jail.
Before we move to a gun control discussion or something else,
I wasn't going to go there.
But I just want to ask you though, is he being prosecuted for cowardice? Because I think that's what this is.
Yeah.
Which is not really a crime, actually. It's interesting. They're throwing the book at him with all this stuff.
Right. Neglect of a child, culpable negligence.
Well, there are families that want to hold someone accountable.
Yeah, perjury is okay, fine. But a lot of the other stuff, it seems like they're basically trying to
perjury.
And I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying it seems to me that they're prosecuting this guy for cowardice. That's what he's a law enforcement officer being prosecuted for cowardice.
I think it's even more than that. You've got families who have pain and loss, and they're thinking, if there was one person who could have done anything, who would that have been? And they're looking at this individual. So beyond the cowardice of his actions, the families are still grieving and need someone to explain how this could have happened.
I actually want to, Buck, what do you think the law enforcement community is going to make of this? I mean, do you think they're going to be nervous about the idea of being, charged for the way they do their job?
I don't think so, because I think that a vast majority of the law enforcement community thinks of a scenario like this, and their first thought is, I wish I had been the guy, because I would have been there after knowing what this guy should have known at a school. These kids have no hope, no help to deal with an active shooter. He is their only help. The one person.
With a gun.
I think 99 out of 100 law enforcement officers are actually angry that this guy is considered a law enforcement officer, because they would have been the first one in the breach.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see what the court case, what the arguments are like, especially in his defense, because I just don't know how he defends himself in this situation.
Unbelievable. Lady and gent, thank you both.
Thanks.
Coming up, you've heard of the Wolf of Wall Street. Well, we're going to tell you about the Fox of Frat Row, and does the Queen have a secret way of messaging her staff in public?
And later we bring you the incredible true story of the friendship between a baby and a baby deer.
I like that one.
When Rising continues.